Hello everyone, my name is Stephen Lawton. I'm Special Projects Editor at SC Media. Welcome to today's Special Market Focus webcast, during which we'll explore the paradigm shifts going passwordless. Today's webcast is sponsored by SecureAuth. Are passwords part of the future? Perhaps not. Going passwordless might seem alien to some, but recent experiences with tightening down of privileges and access controls without passwords seems to be showing some success. The Market Focus survey looks at corporate plans to do away with passwords and other approaches that can be used to reduce vulnerabilities due to compromised credentials. Here with us today to explore the passwordless future is Keith Graham, Chief Technology Officer at SecureAuth. With 17 years in security, product management, product development, and consulting, Keith is recognized as an industry leader in developing adaptive identity security and access control solutions. Today, as the CTO, he leads the product group in creating innovative tools that address evolving business challenges by providing maximum security and a frictionless user experience. After the session, Keith will take questions from the audience. You can submit your questions through the webinar interface. With that, Keith, please take it away.
Hi, afternoon, everybody. So today we're going to talk about how passwords can be suitably removed and how we can get to a passwordless scenario. So we're going to talk through the current state of the password. We're going to examine the results as a result of the SE magazine survey that we did, and we're going to talk about how organizations can actually get to a passwordless scenario. And then, as Stephen said, we're going to take some questions at the end. So the reality is that billions are being spent on network and endpoint security investments within our industry, and these investments are all very well and good. However, we know that breaches still continue to rise, and that's mostly because of the fact that while we've been as an industry focused on network and endpoint security, the reality is that we actually also need to focus on treating identity-based security to the same level as what we're treating those other investments. So in 2016, 81% of breaches involved the use of stolen or default credentials. And these attacks aren't being stopped by those current investments that we're making. And this is only a statistic that is increasing year over year. So what are the challenges with the password? Why we're very used to using it. How can we rely upon it? Well, the reality is that most of us have over 25 active accounts, and we're all suffering from password fatigue and password reuse. Common passwords of default values are very, very commonplace. We're writing them down, and some of the complexity rules that are being put in place are only causing us to reuse those passwords or continue to use other methods of writing them down or logging them, and obviously that's not good from a security standpoint. So, and if we look at what the inventor of the password, Professor Fernando Corbato, has to say about that. He even commented a number of years ago that the password has become a kind of nightmare. It was not intended to obviously be used to the extent that it is using to protect all of the resources that we use it to protect. So even he himself believes that there is some other alternative that we need to look to. So let's examine the survey results as a result of the SE magazine survey that Secure sponsored. We surveyed 500 IT decision makers on what they think about the future of the password. So let's now look at the results. So the first question that we asked our IT decision makers were, what are the biggest IT security challenges for them as of today? And we were actually very pleasantly surprised to see that the number one concern that these IT decision makers have is the ability to detect a breach. So obviously these days organizations are measured on not just their ability to remediate, but their ability to be able to detect and close that response time at the point that the breach is detected. So next we asked our IT decision makers, why are they only using password authentication today, and what will they consider in the next 5 years? So So 50% of IT decision makers within their organizations are only using passwords today, which is obviously somewhat alarming. We also found that only 37% of IT decision makers are using two-factor authentication, so that second factor in addition to the password being the knowledge factor. And then we also found that only 26% of organizations are using two-factor plus some form of risk-based authentication, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So next, we asked our IT decision makers, beyond the password, what would they trust more? So obviously, it can seem like a daunting prospect in removing that password, removing that knowledge factor from the authentication equation. So out of our IT decision makers, we found that 17% would trust using a password plus a method of two-factor authentication. And in a very good way, we found that just under half of all respondents said that they would remove the password entirely as a knowledge factor, and they would trust some form of biometric, in this case a fingerprint, along with using some other form of second factor, as that's something they have, method of authentication, plus in some form of risk analysis. So, and just to round that out, only a minority, around 10%, said that they would actually just keep using the password and the password alone. So what are some of the benefits of eliminating passwords? So we were pleased to see that the main theme here from these results was quite simply that security, while it is the top priority of being able to benefit from the elimination of passwords, the secondary benefit was an enhanced user experience. So removing some of the password fatigue, removing some of the issues that, associated with the fact that users forget their password, they have to reset them, and then third to that was cost. So next we asked our IT decision makers what was the top concern that they had with eliminating the password. So, and this really came as no surprise. We saw that the majority of our IT decision makers were actually concerned about the ability to be able to roll this out to all of their applications. It's a daunting prospect because of all of the integration points that exist within most organizations. There's a lot of applications in use. There's a lot of existing infrastructure investments. There's a lot of existing security investments. So the main concern was the ability to be able to eliminate the password across the board from all of those existing applications investments that the organizations have. So next we asked our IT decision makers, how likely would they be? So what is their opinion on being able to completely eliminate the password? And 39% said that they were very likely. So obviously, it shows that in terms of our mindset, in terms of how we're thinking about this, we're absolutely thinking about it the right way. However, it's worth also just pointing out that still a quarter of respondents still believe that it's unlikely that they would replace the password within the next 5 years. So let's summarize the survey results and just talk a little bit about some of the key takeaways from what we found. So, detecting the breach is still the #1 concern for IT decision makers. Well over half think that removing the password can help stop, or at the very least help provide better protection mechanisms in stopping attacks. And 62% believe that they can increase security or user experience and hopefully try and achieve helping both without using passwords. And then 77%, which is a fantastic number, believe that they can roll out passwordless across all of their applications. So with all of that in mind, across our IT decision makers that we surveyed, let's talk about how password is possible today. So first of all, before we talk about passwords and going passwordless, it's important to consider how do we achieve suitable levels of trust and confidence in authentication today. So we're all familiar with the concepts of single-factor authentication. We use a password every single day. We use passwords as our knowledge factor. And then when we consider two-factor authentication, it's obviously building upon the fact that you have a knowledge factor, but then in addition, you can add a second factor in the form of something I have in the form of hardware, or it can be something that I am in the form of a biometric. So as we look to displace the password as our knowledge factor, it's important to realize that we need to still maintain that level of trust. So what we can do is we can remove the knowledge factor entirely from the equation, and then we can look to substitute that just by using hardware in the form of something that the user has. We can use a biometric as a way of gaining access to that hardware. And then we can also, most importantly, layer risk analysis on top of that as well. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So it's all very well having multiple factors of authentication in the form of something that the user has in terms of hardware. It's all very well and good having access and gating access to that in the form of a biometric. But what's ever so important is conducting risk analysis as well behind the scenes. So even by removing that knowledge factor, we can gain a high level of trust by analyzing different characteristics around how the end user is authenticating, such as gathering their geographic location information, ensuring that they're using known devices that we may have seen before, ensuring that the devices are not compromised, ensuring that the internet infrastructure that they're coming in from is known and not associated with any anomalous or attacker activities. So by taking into account all of these risk layers and combining that with the assurance that we're getting from the fact that the user has a device in their possession, we can actually provide a very, very compelling user experience, but also increase security as well, because we're no longer now dependent on the fact that that password has to be stored centrally within some identity store or is cached or being stored on the user's device that they attempted to access from. And now, also as well, you know, in addition to the survey results, it's also worth pointing out that Gartner, based upon some of their recent research, have said that by 2019, in medium use cases, risk reduction will be available simply because of the fact that the use of tokens and passwords can also be eliminated from the equation. So we at SecureAuth are actually pretty realistic about the fact that, you know, passwordless isn't going to happen overnight. Passwordless does give us a very, very good balance of high security as well as a much better end user experience. But we also understand that enterprises are complex, and being able to provide passwordless involves high degrees of integration into many existing applications, and it involves integrating at all the existing points by which your users would authenticate, whether it's at the edge in the case of the VPN, whether it's access to an SSO for access to all of your applications, whether it's at the endpoint device at which point your users log on, or whether it's for mobile devices where your users are attempting to access mobile applications. But we understand that all of those integration points obviously can make the notion of going passwordless quite daunting. And in some use cases, passwordless may not be possible. However, you can still achieve a much higher degree of security as well as user experience by employing risk-based authentication behind the scenes in order to help mitigate some of the risks that are associated with the password and ultimately try and prevent the misuse of stolen credentials. So that's it for me. So I think we're now going to examine some of the questions that have been asked.
Okay. So let's see. We have a question here. Where would I integrate passwordless into my authentication scheme? Can you give some examples of where it would apply?
Yes, certainly. So actually, this is where we would discuss typically with organizations how are their users authenticating today. Where or what points of authentication do you care about? So, you know, more often than not, authentication at the edge, so at the VPN, is obviously a very prominent place that users typically would use a password and hopefully a second factor. However, you know, that is also a very good candidate to apply a passwordless capability. Second to that would be what we would see typically is most organizations are providing some form of single sign-on access to all of their applications. Now, single sign-on is great at providing a good user experience, but also reducing risk around users reusing passwords and suffering from password reuse and fatigue. But that's also a great candidate to put passwordless in front of that as well. So your users are accessing that and authenticating in a very strong way, and then they're getting access to all of their applications. The next major use case would be endpoint authentication. So the point where people, users log in or use their password to lock or unlock their device, whether it be a Windows machine or a Mac. So they're the typical areas that we would see. And then kind of separate from sort of day-to-day user usage in terms of the workforce, we also have to consider consumer access as well. So very typically, organizations with consumer portals, homegrown applications would very typically look to leverage some sort of API capability in order to leverage passwordless.
Okay. Another question here. Do I have to have a risk analysis to do passwordless? Couldn't I just use biometrics instead of traditional passwords?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So we have to. I think it's important for us to consider, what is the level of trust that we're trying to achieve. So in the case of passwordless, we're removing that knowledge factor from the user. So in this case, we're depending upon something that the user has in their possession, and ideally combining that with something that the user is in the form of a biometric if they're attempting to use, say, a smartphone for access. What the risk analysis gives us is that it gives us much better assurance that we are not just letting the good guy in that has the device in their possession, but we're also ensuring that we're keeping the bad guys out by performing this risk analysis. So ultimately, it's buying us a much higher degree of assurance. But it's also important to point out as well that all of the risk analysis layers aren't just providing us and affording us these levels of protection. They're also affording us a fantastic detection capability as well, because all of the attribution data, all of the information around how the user authenticates can be used by an organization to determine whether there is some risk associated with how that user is authenticating.
Okay. Can you explain the biometric a bit more? Is this additional software, or are you utilizing capability on the smartphone for the fingerprint scan, for example?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So passwordless can be achieved like we discussed by using the something that the user has in their possession in the form of a device, and ultimately to provide the best possible user experience, that would be a smartphone device that does have a fingerprint sensor capability. So in the case of Apple devices, obviously leveraging Touch ID. In the case of Samsung or Google-based devices, leveraging those capabilities that they have there. So we're building upon the fact that fingerprint recognition in consumer smartphones is widely adopted and provides a very, very compelling user experience, but also affords us that additional level of trust by ensuring that the user that is using that device and authenticating using passwordless is who they identify themselves to be.
Okay. Many vendors are offering passwordless, and this has been talked about for years. How is this different from what we've heard in the past?
Yeah, so this is different simply because of the fact that in order to achieve a good level of trust, we have to perform risk analysis. We have to perform adaptive authentication. And what that affords us is the ability to, like I described earlier, to analyze a whole number of characteristics around how the user is authenticating. So that doesn't just provide us better levels of assurance around how we protect organizations, but it also provides a detection capability in how we can enable organizations to better detect the way in which their users are ultimately authenticating. I think what the key here is as well, and how this is differentiated, is simply the fact that part of SecureAuth's philosophy is we don't dictate to our customers what their end user experience should be, what that user journey should be. And not only that, we also, most importantly, balance a good user experience as well as strong security. So while we've mentioned some of the types of authenticators that can be used here in terms of using a consumer smartphone device as something that the user has, combined with gating that with some form of biometric in terms of leveraging the capability that's on that smartphone device. The methods that are used for authentication can really be chosen by the customer. So, there are many different methods of second factor out there, and those many different methods of second factor can be used as the primary authenticators. So, and that allows, in many cases, for organizations to consider passwordless without having to have a large investment in smartphone devices. We understand that there are legacy forms of access that may be required, and so that flexibility, as well as those workflows combined with the adaptive risk analysis techniques in the form of adaptive authentication, it's a combination of all of those things that really make this a secure way of achieving a good level of trust and balancing end user experience.
And looks like we have time for just one more question, then we'll have to close. Has passwordless capability been built into most operating systems?
If we consider sort of the two prominent OS vendors, if we take, say, Microsoft and we take Apple, so there are definitely moves today to leverage wearables. That's something that Apple supports today. There are definitely moves that Microsoft have made, and they've made very, very good progress in trying to achieve interoperability with open standards such as FIDO on more modern versions of Windows. However, we don't have to wait for the OS vendors in order to provide that type of capability. In SecureAuth's case, we consider passwordless authentication at the endpoint just as important as, say, performing passwordless authentication at the SSO portal or, say, at the VPN. So that is a value-added need that SecureAuth is able to provide as part of its passwordless solution.
Well, this is a topic, of course, that we could talk about all day, but unfortunately we have run out of time, and that does bring us to the close of today's session. There are still some questions that we didn't get a chance to get to. Those questions will all be turned over to Keith and his team. They will be able to get back to you folks after the event. If you'd like to revisit this session, it will be available on the SC Media website shortly, and you'll be able to listen to it once again. I'd like to take this opportunity once again to thank Keith Graham, SecureAuth CTO, for providing us with some fascinating information on going passwordless. And in the meantime, I'd like to thank everybody for coming and joining us. We look forward to having you join us again in the future. So thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. And if you're on the space station, I guess it's all three at once. We look forward to having you back again soon.